All right, hello students. Today we're doing chapter 6, adaptations to aerobic endurance training programs. This chapter, there's really not a ton to it. I am going to focus on a couple really key concepts. Right, and I just noticed this lady right here, Anne Swank, she was one of my mentors. I didn't even know that she co-wrote this chapter. Pretty cool. Okay, so there's some terms that if you can master these terms, you will understand the cardiovascular system, how it responds during exercise, and then how it adapts. Okay, and those terms that we see on the slide here are part of this very important equation that is known as the Fick equation. Okay. Now, in my opinion, any student who graduates with an exercise science degree should have a good understanding of the Fick equation, okay? So, again, that's the main thing I'm going to hit on in this lecture, because if you understand the Fick equation, then you got the cardiovascular system down in terms of how it responds to exercise, okay? So, we see the Fick equation stated here. VO2, so oxygen consumption, or you could also look at it as energy expenditure, is equal to Q, and Q stands for cardiac output. Okay, and what that means is the amount of blood pumped by the heart per minute, and that is usually measured in liters per minute or milliliters per minute. It kind of just depends. At rest, it might be milliliters because it's a smaller number. During exercise, it's often expressed as liters because it's a higher amount of blood exiting the heart per minute during exercise. Okay, now you could further break down cardiac output into two sub-components, and we see those here. So stroke volume times heart rate. Heart rate, we know, is the number of times that the heart beats per minute, and we reflect heart rate using the unit beats per minute, or BPM. Stroke volume is defined here. So this is the amount of blood ejected with every heartbeat. Okay, again, stroke volume is usually expressed in milliliters per minute. Sorry, milliliters per beat. I just made a big boo-boo. That's incorrect, okay? Because, again, stroke volume is the amount of blood per beat. Heart rate is beats per minute. When those two combine, you get the total amount of blood exiting the heart per minute, okay? So that is the first half of the Fick equation, and we often refer to this as the central component because it has to do with the heart and sort of like this central part of the body. Now, the other half of the equation is listed here. So this one looks a little bit more maybe complicated to you, but it's actually pretty simple as well. It's the AVO2 difference. And what that means is A stands for arterial blood. V stands for venous blood. And what we're looking at is the oxygen, the difference in the oxygen concentration between the arterial blood and the venous blood. Now, think about it for a second in your head. Which side should have more oxygen in it? The arterial or the venous? The answer is here in front of you. The arterial blood should have a higher concentration because, right, the oxygen comes into the lungs, the blood is oxygenated at the lungs, and then the arterial side of circulation takes the blood from the lungs out to the tissues where it can be delivered. The tissues extract oxygen, right, and then the blood returns back to the heart and lungs in the venous side, or in venous circulation, in the veins, right, where there is a lower concentration. So what we're looking at is the difference in the oxygen concentrations. Now let's think about this for a second. During exercise, how would that change? Does the difference get bigger, get smaller? The difference should get bigger, right? Because if the muscles are active, then the muscles are going to be taking out more oxygen from the arterial blood. Therefore, there will be less oxygen returning in the venous circulation. So therefore, the difference will be larger, okay? So during exercise, the cardiac output is higher because the heart is beating faster. More blood is exiting the heart per heartbeat. Therefore, the Q, cardiac output, goes up. As the muscles are active, the muscles are pulling more oxygen out of the arterial blood, therefore leaving less in the venous blood relative to resting conditions. Therefore, the AVO2 difference grows, it gets wider, okay? And again, the combined effect of those two things, both increasing, is for VO2 to increase. Pretty simple. Now, we might rewrite this equation, and if we added max at the end of VO2, so VO2 max is your maximal exercise capacity. At your VO2 max, you would also be at a level of maximal cardiac output, okay? And then probably at a level of maximal AVO2 difference as well. Usually the Q is going to reach its max before the AVO2 diff ever does. But at your VO2 max, you should be at a Q max. The AVO2 difference may or may not be there, okay? So let's look at some of the acute responses. Now this is an important word. I want to make sure you all understand this as well. We can talk about two types of responses. Acute means what occurs when the activity is happening, right? So when I'm exercising, my heart rate goes up. When I'm exercising, my breathing goes up. Then the chronic responses are more like the adaptations that occur in response to training, okay? So we'll talk about those a little bit later, but let's focus on acute responses first. So as I mentioned, when we're exercising, our cardiac output should increase, okay? There's going to be an initial rapid increase as we move from resting to steady state exercise, okay? And then the increase will be more gradual as we approach our VO2 max. And at the VO2 max, we would reach this plateau in cardiac output. And what that means is, even if we start exercising harder, our cardiac output is not going to increase anymore. It's going to kind of reach a ceiling, and then it's going to level off at that ceiling versus busting through the ceiling, okay? Now, as far as how much it can increase, you see here, the cardiac output may increase 4 to 5 times resting when we're exercising in a maximal capacity. The other variables, or the sub-variables, right? If cardiac output increases, then naturally you would expect that heart rate and stroke volume would increase, and they do, okay? So the heart, is a muscle, right? During exercise, the sympathetic nervous system, and I'm actually on this bullet point here, the sympathetic nervous system is going to act on the heart to make the heart muscle contract more forcefully, okay? So the heart is beating less forcefully at rest. Once we start exercising, the heart starts beating more forcefully, and that is going to allow for more blood to be ejected for every heartbeat, okay? So that sympathetic nervous system stimulation that occurs during exercise increases the amount of blood flow that exits the heart per heartbeat, and that would drive stroke volume up. Sympathetic nervous system also increases the rate of contraction, and therefore the heart rate is going to increase. And we say that increases in a linear fashion. And what that means is it's basically a straight line. As exercise intensity goes up, heart rate should increase in a linear fashion, and it should be, again, a nice slope that is consistent, okay? So again, both of those things, increasing, faster rates, more forceful contraction, meaning more blood is exiting per heartbeat, combine to allow for this increased cardiac output, all right? And the effect of that is that oxygen uptake, or VO2, should also increase in a linear fashion with exercise intensity, okay? Up until you reach your VO2 max, at which point that value will fail to increase even if you exercise harder. Some other factors that it says here on the slide that influence oxygen uptake, the amount of exercising muscle mass. The best example of this is if you're exercising all out on a treadmill and a bike, okay? The VO2 on a treadmill is going to be higher because you're using your arms when you're running, while when you're on a bike, your arms are stationary, okay? So even if you're working as hard as you can in both cases, the VO2 typically is higher on a treadmill because you're using your upper body and your lower body. On the cycle, you're just using your lower body only, okay? So again, that maximal capacity is what we refer to as maximal oxygen uptake, and the symbol that we use to kind of write that in shorthand is Vo2 max. Okay, Vo2 max is generally recognized as the gold standard for aerobic fitness, for exercise capacity, for functional capacity. The higher your Vo2 max is, the higher your functional capacity is. And what that really represents is the maximal amount of oxygen that your body can utilize for energy production, right? So if you have a higher Vo2 max, your body is going to be able to bring in and utilize more oxygen to create energy versus somebody with a lower Vo2 max, okay? People who've had heart attacks, their Vo2 maxes could be as low as 15 ml per kg per minute, where elite athletes could be 70 ml per kg per minute. Average for college students is about 35 to 45, just to kind of put it in perspective a little bit, okay? Now, another key term is resting VO2, or resting oxygen uptake. This is the amount of oxygen that is consumed at rest. Usually this is estimated for like the entire population to be 3.5 ml per kg per minute, okay? In my experience of actually measuring people's resting metabolic rate, I've actually found it to be a lot lower, but I think that often reflects the population that you're measuring. People who are sedentary or overweight, they're not going to have as high of a resting metabolic rate as somebody who is very muscular and or very active, okay? Usually people who come into my lab and do a resting metabolic rate test are interested in losing weight, and therefore they would fit that first category, okay? All right, so back to the acute responses. Now we're looking at blood pressure. So with blood pressure, we divide blood pressure into a systolic and a diastolic. Systolic is when the heart is contracting. That's the bigger number, the one we list first. Diastolic is the pressure when the heart is relaxing. So it's a smaller number, and we list that one second. Now, so when we look at the effect of exercise, we have to analyze the numbers independently. And what we see on this chart is the diastolic, which is in red. In a healthy individual, there should not be much change at all, okay? Usually we say, shoot, sorry that keeps happening. We say little to no change in diastolic pressure as a function of exercise intensity, which is shown here at the bottom. Now, on the other hand, with the systolic pressure, we're going to go back to that word linear, and we see that there should be a linear increase in the systolic pressure as a function of exercise intensity. So the higher the intensity, the higher the systolic pressure should go, up until, again, we reach our max capacity, and that will be like your maximal systolic blood pressure. Now, the reason this occurs, kind of like we mentioned with stroke volume earlier, you know, as our exercise intensity increases, the heart is going to beat more forcefully. That can assist in driving the blood pressure up. There's also going to be more vasoconstriction going on out in the body. That's going to drive blood pressure up as well. But when the heart is relaxing, there should still be the same pressure during exercise that there is at rest, and that is why the diastolic should not change much. Okay, it might go up a little bit, might go down a little bit, should stay pretty consistent. If you see a large jump in the diastolic blood pressure when somebody is exercising, then you should stop exercising right away. That's a sign or symptom of a possible disease process working. Now, another important component is to think about how does blood flow get redistributed during exercise, rest versus exercise. So what we see on this pie chart, these two pie charts, at rest, we're pumping out about 5,000 milliliters of blood per minute. That's our cardiac output. And the blood gets kind of evenly distributed throughout the whole body, right? If you look at this chart, you know, liver gets 27, kidneys 22, muscles 20, brain gets 14, skin 6, heart 4. Now, during max exercise, first of all, let's point out that our cardiac output increases by 5. So it went from 5,000 milliliters per minute to 25,000 milliliters per minute. we have the same amount of blood in our body. It's not like we get more blood when we exercise. What happens is the circuit is cycling faster, right? The heart's beating faster, so that blood is circulating a lot faster. It's the same amount of blood, it's just getting pumped out a lot more often. But look at the change, right? Everything, well, not everything actually. Mainly these three things. Liver goes from 27 to 2%. Kidneys go from 22% to 1%. And the absolute amount also goes down. 1350 here, 500 here. 1100 here, 250 here. Other tissues, 7% down to 3%. The overall amount actually goes up. Notice that, 350. Oh gosh darn it, there we go, 780. Now interestingly, it looks like the brain percentage goes down a lot from 14% to 4%, but the overall amount actually goes up. We go from 700 milliliters to the brain to now 900 milliliters. And the way that can happen, again, is because we're pumping out so much more blood. Overall, more is going, just the percentage goes down a little bit. The heart sees kind of a similar thing. It says 4%, but the total amount is higher, 1,000 versus 200. Skin, 6%, 2%, so that stays pretty consistent. But the biggest change is muscle, right? 20% at rest to 84% during max exercise. So the muscles are just gobbling up. They're wanting all that blood. Send that blood to me, the muscles are saying. Percentage goes way up, and the overall amount goes from 1,000 to 21,000, right? So there's a trade-off. Because we only have a fixed amount of blood in the body, if we're going to send more to one area, as we do to the muscles, we have to send less to other areas, and that's why we see this big reduction right here, okay? The way that we do that is by looking at this word here, constriction of certain blood vessels called arterioles. During exercise, those arterioles close off to some tissues and they open up to muscles, right? That helps redirect the blood flow to where it needs to go. So key point, during exercise, we see all of these things that we mentioned earlier increase. Diastolic blood pressure may decrease, but often we just say it stays the same. But there may be a slight decrease. So pretty much across the board, all the variables are going to increase during aerobic exercise, which makes sense, right? The body needs more oxygen-rich blood, so the cardiovascular system responds to deliver more oxygen-rich blood. We're going to quickly talk about the respiratory responses. Obviously, we've been talking about oxygen quite a bit. We can't deliver more oxygen to the muscles if we don't first bring more oxygen into our body, right? So there are a series of respiratory responses that occur ultimately that allow us to bring in more oxygen and then expire more CO2, because part of the consequence of producing energy is we're going to have CO2 that we have to get rid of. So we're going to bring in more oxygen, expel more CO2 during exercise, of course. One way that we do that is by increasing a specific volume of air that we call the tidal volume, which is the amount of air that somebody breathes in during one normal breath, okay? That's going to go way up during exercise. And you'll notice that, right? When you're at rest, your breathing is maybe more shallow. You're breathing in smaller volumes of air. But once you start exercising, you're going to bring in more air per breath. You're going to breathe more deeply, and you're also going to expire more fully as well. So you're going to be moving more air in and out per breath than you do at rest. And the way that we are able to do that is because we have sort of this, what they call dead space, that we don't use at rest, but we can take advantage of it during exercise. I'm going to skip through this slide because I've kind of already talked about it a great deal. Here's a good visual representation of what is happening. our respiratory system largely relies on pressure gradients, and during exercise, because we're using more oxygen, the pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is going to drop. So in order to get it back to where it needs to be, we're going to bring more oxygen in. Conversely, the partial pressure of CO2 is going to increase during exercise, which is going to lead us to get it out again to normalize it. So we don't really need to say much more about that here in this slide. And I'm going to skip through this one as well and move on to adaptations of the cardiovascular system. So much as we saw several of the values increase during exercise, we also see a lot of these same values increase as a result of training. So this is what we would call an adaptation or a chronic response. Okay, so cardiac output goes up, stroke volume goes up. We have more capillaries that surround our muscles. That allows for a greater AVO2 difference. Oxygen extraction is going to go up if we have more capillaries around the muscle. On the flip side, part of the trade-off of stroke volume going up is that heart rate can actually go down, right? If you're pumping out more blood per beat, then you don't need to have as many beats. So the heart becomes more efficient, right? It accomplishes more with less effort. That's kind of a good definition of efficiency. So the heart becomes more efficient after experiencing aerobic training adaptations. As far as our respiratory adaptations go, breathing is also going to become more efficient. Again, the body's going to be better able to extract oxygen out of what it has, so it's not going to need as much. Okay. There are neural adaptations, which we're not going to really touch on here, but there are neural adaptations that allow for breathing, the mechanical act of breathing to become more efficient as well, which again in turn supplies more oxygen to feed this increased Vo2 max. Muscular adaptations, this one is more important because what happens at the muscle really directly affects the AVO2 difference. Okay, I didn't say this earlier, but we said the cardiac output is the central component because it's occurring in the central body cavity. The AVO2 difference is, we call it the peripheral component, so it's away from the middle because it's more referring to what's happening in the arms, legs, out in the extremities, okay? Or in other words, where the muscles are, right? So there are some very important adaptations, that occur within or around muscles that allow for the AVO2 difference to go up, and that in turn allows for the Vo2 max to go up as well. So let's talk about those. Three big things. First, by exposing our body to training, aerobic training, in the muscles like being stimulated to require more oxygen, the body's going to take steps to make sure we can get more oxygen-rich blood to the muscle. One way that it does that is by the growth of more capillaries. So a trained muscle will have more capillaries surrounding it. Those increased amount of capillaries will allow for more oxygen to be pulled out of the blood into the muscle. So I like to kind of summarize that as we have a greater ability to extract oxygen from the blood. Okay, so that's step one. Step two, we're going to have a better ability to transport oxygen in the muscle itself. And the way that we do that is by increasing the concentration of this protein called myoglobin. Now that's going to sound familiar to you because you've probably heard of the word hemoglobin. Hemoglobin carries oxygen in the blood. Myoglobin carries oxygen in the muscle. The more myoglobin a muscle has, the faster it can transport oxygen from the cell wall to the mitochondria, which is its ultimate destination. Speaking of mitochondria, that is the third key adaptation that occurs in the muscle. Through aerobic training, our body produces more mitochondria, and those mitochondria pack inside the muscle. Inside the mitochondria is where aerobic energy production occurs. So the more mitochondria that we have, the more oxygen we can use and the more ATP we can produce, right? So to put a bow on that, to summarize it, greater ability to extract oxygen, greater ability to transport oxygen, and then greater ability to utilize oxygen. All three of those things combine to improve our AVO2 difference, which then in turn improves Vo2 max. Okay, told you this stuff was simple. Couple key concepts. Remember that Fick equation. All right, as far as bone and connective tissue adaptations, again, I'm not going to really touch much on this because it doesn't really apply to the cardiovascular system, but just keep in mind that your body's going to respond to whatever type of stress you put on it. Okay, if you put weight-bearing stress on your musculoskeletal system, it will respond by strengthening those tissues. So things like running, that's probably the best one. Using a Stairmaster could be another one where you're moving your own body weight against gravity. That's going to put some strain on your connective tissues, and those connective tissues will get stronger and more supportive, and therefore more resistant to injury, which is important. Okay. On the other hand, things like cycling, which are not weight-bearing, they would have a much lower effect versus a weight-bearing activity such as running. Okay, so keep that in mind. Some people need to do non-weight-bearing activity for various reasons. However, weight-bearing activity is always going to produce a stronger adaptation for those who are physically able to participate in it. Endocrine adaptations, we've already touched on these, a whole chapter on it. The biggest one has to do with the sympathetic nervous system. By exposing your body to stress over and over and over again, and I'm talking about the stress of, let's just say, running, eventually your body's not going to respond as strongly to that stressor because it's going to be used to it. Therefore, the sympathetic nervous system is not going to exert as much influence, right? That's one reason why heart rate is typically lower after training, because you're not having as big of a stress response, sympathetic nervous system response, driving that heart rate up. So that's probably the major endocrine adaptation that occurs in response to aerobic exercise. So in general, again, we could summarize globally these adaptations by saying that we're going to have an increase in maximal oxygen uptake. Okay, and most of that is going to be based upon increasing cardiac output, but as we documented, there is a impact on AVO2 difference as well. Okay, as we talked about with regards to strength training, the intensity of the training often is going to have a direct impact on the amount of adaptation. The higher the intensity, the stronger, the larger the adaptation will be. Okay, the lower the intensity, the lower the adaptation will be. Same thing applies here. But again, some people, older people, people with chronic diseases, they're not going to be able to do the intensity that a younger, healthier person can do. Therefore, their adaptations would typically be less. But that's just kind of part of the trade-off. Something is better than nothing, especially if somebody has chronic disease that they're trying to manage and improve their quality of life with. So a couple key points again here to wrap it up. These are the adaptations. I didn't mention this, but of course, doing more physical activity, which aerobic exercise would certainly be, you're gonna reduce body fat stores. The more calories you burn, the more energy you burn through exercise, the less you're going to store, and therefore body fat should reduce. These other things, we hit on this one. Running economy really refers back to that word that I used earlier, efficiency. A runner who is more economical, they're going to be able to accomplish more with less energy. Okay, and we talked about that with regards to heart rate, right? So that's a major adaptation, right? You can run fast, but you're not burning as much energy as somebody who is not an economical runner. And they use the word running economy, but that can apply to cycling, whatever the activity is. They just call it running economy. Okay. These two we kind of hit on with the muscular adaptations. Part of having more mitochondria means you're going to have more enzymes in the muscle because the enzymes are found inside the mitochondria. So more mitochondria means more enzymes. Greater ability to rely on aerobic metabolism, which is sort of the point of this lecture, means less reliance on glycolysis and therefore less lactate production. Lactate is probably the thing that promotes fatigue the most. So the less of that you produce, you can keep exercising. So that is another really positive thing about experiencing some aerobic training adaptations. Okay. Now I'm going to finish up with just a few things that will determine somebody's rate of adaptation or the magnitude of their adaptation. First one is genetic potential. Some people are just genetically more able to be like aerobic athletes than others. Okay. You get the mitochondrial DNA from your maternal side. So think about yourself. If you're a really good endurance athlete, chances are your mom is too. Okay. Or maybe she is and just doesn't know it. Like I feel like I'm a pretty decent endurance athlete, but my mom isn't, but maybe she just never tried. I don't know. But we all have a genetic potential, right? Like Lance Armstrong has a very high Vo2 max of 70 ml per kg per minute, which is outstanding. Mine, personally, is only like 55. Still good, but I'll never get up to the level of Lance Armstrong because genetically he is just more built and engineered to have a higher Vo2 max than a regular person like myself, okay? Other factors, we have age and gender. Now, as I've said many times in class, on average, men have higher Vo2 maxes than females, but if you took any two given individuals, that wouldn't be the case. Just this week in my lab class at University of Louisville, we had a female cross-country and track runner do a Vo2 max test in the lab, and she got a 63 ml per kg per minute, which is a very high value, right? And I just told you, like, mine is 55 or something, so hers is much higher than mine. So again, on average, males are higher, but any two given individuals may not be the case, okay? Because that's a good example, again, of her having a very high genetic potential, which is probably why she's a college athlete, which I was not. As far as age, now we typically see a decrease in Vo2 max as people age. There is some age-related decline. However, most of this can be attributed to another thing that often occurs as people age, and that is that they become less active, right? I'm 45 years old and I still have a Vo2 max over 50 because I'm very physically active. If I found another 45-year-old who is sedentary, that person's would be much, much lower, I'm sure. Okay? So yes, there is going to be some decline with age. However, staying physically active, challenging your body to respond to stress, you can maintain your aerobic adaptations, not completely, but mostly by staying active. So that's important. As you all transition out of college, get jobs, you're going to be tempted to be less active. Fight it, stay active, and you can maintain your functional capacity as you get up to being an old person like me. Now, let's say you stop training. Well, what's going to happen? You're going to experience what is known as detraining. Detraining refers to the loss of training adaptations. With regards to aerobic training, what we typically say is for 2 weeks, you're going to be fine. If you have to take 2 weeks off because you're sick, you're not going to experience any reductions in your training adaptations, okay? But beyond the 2 weeks, you're going to start to see your Vo2 max drop off a little bit, okay? And there's really two phases of the drop off. The first phase is going to be based upon reduced cardiac output. And you're going to see a pretty steep drop there, okay? The second phase is a little bit more, it's not as dramatic, but it's a longer reduction, and that is due to the reduction in AVO2 difference, mostly based on loss of muscle mitochondria, okay? So 2 weeks, no change. 2 to 4 weeks, you see a reduction due to lost cardiac output adaptations. And then you have this third phase where you continue to see a reduction in your Vo2 max due to loss of muscle mitochondria, okay? So remember, you got about 2 weeks before you're going to start seeing these reductions, okay? Now, often people, they train less before a competition. That's what's referred to as tapering. And the key thing with this is you're going to reduce the volume, but as long as you maintain the intensity, that is enough to maintain your adaptations. Okay, so it's a good idea before your last meet of the season, a big competition, a tournament, whatever sport you're playing. You're going to taper, you're going to reduce your training load volume-wise, which is the amount of training, but you're going to keep your intensity high because that will help you maintain most of the adaptations that you work so hard for during your training seasons. So key point, again, specificity is very important. So if you want to be a good runner, you got to run. If you want to be a good bike cyclist, you got to cycle. And that applies to every sport, okay? However, you do need to have variation, manipulate your intensity, have recovery periods, etc., because you want to avoid progressing to being overtrained, which is where you've had too much of a stimulus for too long of a period of time, and your body then goes into a state of what we call maladaptation, where you start to reverse rapidly, and you could develop some other issues that would inhibit your exercise performance. Okay, so that wraps it up. Tasks, we have the lecture study questions and the critical thinking assignment. The critical thinking assignment this week is going to really ask you to explain the Fick equation to me. So again, that's the key point. If you can remember how to explain the Fick equation, then you will master cardiovascular responses to exercise. Okay, so good luck with that, and I will come back and talk to you all next week. Take care.